We've been discussing the voting history of marginalized communities in the United States, and we're discussing the 19th Amendment. Last time we were together, we gave some background, specifically about the suffragettes and, well, how they were racists. Yeah, you know I love telling the story about how Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were, racists. Yeah, they said that if anyone was going to have the right to vote, it should be intelligent white women, not Sambo. I'm paraphrasing. And then they turned to Southern white racists for help. Meanwhile, Frances Ellen Watkin Harper and Frederick Douglass were like, black men should have the right to vote so that we can have a voice in the political process and maybe white people will stop unaliving us. There's that. And then we talked about Seneca Falls Convention, where Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were like, we women want a bunch of stuff to make women, equal. And, hey, give us the right to vote. And that brings us to the many failed attempts to pass a federal amendment that gives women, white women, the right to vote. And don't forget the quiz. Do you remember what the quiz was? It was, when were the majority, 90%, of black women, Mexican American women, Asian American women, and Native American women able to vote? That answer at the end of our conversation. Let's begin. December 1866, during a debate over a District of Columbia suffrage bill, Senator Edgar Cohen from Pennsylvania introduced an amendment to provide for women's suffrage. The Senate defeats Cohen's amendment by a vote of 9-37. Senator Samuel C. Pomeroy of Kansas introduces the federal women's suffrage amendment. It says, the basis of suffrage in the United States shall be that of citizenship, and all native or naturalized citizens shall enjoy the same rights and privileges of the elective franchise. 3 days later, the Senate agrees to let Pomeroy's bill lie upon the table, meaning that there was going to be no debate and no vote. Gradually, throughout the second half of the 19th century, certain states and territories extended often limited voting rights to women. Wyoming Territory granted women the right to vote in all elections in 1869. Idaho granted women suffrage in 1896. Now, as far as Wyoming goes, when they became a state, they became the first state whose constitution guaranteed women the right to vote. Beginning with Washington in 1910, 7 more Western states passed women's suffrage legislation, including California in 1911, Oregon, Arizona, and Kansas in 1912, Alaska Territory in 1913, and Montana and Nevada in 1914. All states that were successful in securing full voting rights for women before 1920 were located in the West. In 1878, a constitutional amendment called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment was introduced in Congress that would enshrine women's suffrage for all elections. It says, the right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. Suffragettes would testify for the first time before senators on the issue of women's suffrage. A decade later, an amendment proposed in 1888 in the House of Representatives called for limited suffrage for women who were spinsters or widows who owned property. A decade later. By 1918, 15 states had extended equal voting rights to women, And the Susan B. Anthony Amendment was formally supported by both parties and by President Woodrow Wilson. The proposal for women's suffrage was brought before the House January 1918 and passed by only one vote. The vote was then carried to the Senate, where Wilson made an appeal on the Senate floor, an unprecedented action at the time. He says, "Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege and right?" The proposal fell 2 votes short of passage, prompting the NWP to direct campaigning against senators who had voted against the amendment. Between January 1918 and June 1919, the House and the Senate voted on the federal amendment 5 times. And guess who kept opposing the amendment? Did somebody say Southern Democrats? White Southern Democrats? Yeah, because that's absolutely correct. They kept opposing the amendment. FYI, white Southern Democrats are the equivalent to today's Republicans. Okay? Okay. Now, the suffragettes pressured President Wilson to call a special session of Congress, and he agreed to schedule one for May 19, 1919. And the amendment finally passed. The Southern Democrats abandoned the filibuster, and the amendment passed the Senate. It was ratified in 1920, again, 52 years before I was born. And it says, "The right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." Adoption of the 19th Amendment enfranchised 26 million American women in time for the 1920 U.S. presidential election. Now remember, earlier I clarified and I said that the 19th Amendment gave white women the right to vote. Because by this time, blacks, which over 90% lived in the South, were being disenfranchised through poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation. So, black women would not be able to vote under the 19th Amendment. 3 million black women south of the Mason-Dixon line remained disenfranchised after the passage of the amendment. As newly enfranchised black women attempted to register, officials increased the use of methods described as fraud, intimidation, poll taxes, and state violence. In 1926, a group of black women attempting to register in Birmingham, Alabama, were beaten by officials. Regarding Native Americans, Native Americans were not considered citizens until 1924. And Asian Americans were not considered citizens until 1952. Both were hit with poll taxes, literacy tests, intimidation, and English comprehension tests. Mexicans were citizens, but like blacks, they were impacted with poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidations. So, Native American women, Asian American women, and Latinas could not vote under the 19th Amendment. So, really, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, though they did not live to see the 19th Amendment, they did a good job of ensuring that white women got the right to vote and no one else. So to our question, do you know when over 90% of black women, Mexican American women, Asian American women, and Native American women were able to vote? Black women were not able to vote until 1965. The majority of Mexican American, Asian American, and Native American women could not vote until 1965, the rest 1975. Now, this is because of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The 1975 part? Well, that's because a provision was added to the Voting Rights Act of 1965 for what is called language minority individuals. 1975 is 3 years after I was born. Some of us have only been able to vote for 49 years.